The old world is ending, and we have the opportunity to rethink everything. This is a show about the structural problems in our world and the real solutions that we have today to transition from an apocalyptic storm of war, scarcity, and ecological collapse into a collaborative and sustainable futuristic society that serves all life. You may think it's an impossible dream, but the alternative is an inevitable nightmare. We're your hosts, Zachary Marlowe, Matt Holton, and Amanda Smith. And together, when we can move past this economic absurdity to come together and actualize our collective potential to create something completely new, we are Moneyless Society. All right, so I was going to write out an intro for this episode because it's a really important topic. One of the root of all roots of our disorder, our disconnection from nature. But today, I'm out of it, right? News has got my blood pressure about to explode, construction out my window, sirens in the distance, world is ending, what's new? I'm in New York City, it's almost 100 degrees, haven't even been able to move all day. I just feel completely immobilized by this heat pulsing through the concrete and metal glass of this false world. It's oppressively hot because humanity has been burning carbon in industrial slag heaps like this pollution machine of a city for so long that we've altered our climate of this whole planet, and we just have to sweat it out, which is the least of our worries. I feel trapped and caged in this unnatural, like completely artificial environment. Like nothing in this environment is natural, or normal or intuitive. Piles of garbage, up to my waist out my window. It's normal. And even when I do see patches of nature, it's like they're here despite all our efforts to destroy them, like they're an aberration or something. I'm in this wasteland, and the only trees are in these little disconnected islands of parched dirt in a sea of concrete. That's how I feel right now, and that's the microcosm of the whole society that we're living in. We're parched. We're deprived of everything we really need to live, living in a way that is totally unintuitive to us, that we just continually are gaslit into thinking is normal, is natural, is progressive, is an advancement. We're deprived of some deeper connection to the world we live in and to who we really are. And that's a microcosm of the whole society that we're living in. We're parched. We're deprived of any deeper connection to the world around us, to how we have evolved to live and who we really are. Today's show is hopefully going to be able to slake that thirst and provide us with some life-giving insight, help us get back into who we really are. Our guest today is joining us from Hawaii. Wild Quetzal is a nature-based content creator and teacher, reminding people who they've always been. So Quetzal, what does that mean to you to be disconnected from nature?
For sure, absolutely. Like the dominant culture of the West is definitely predominantly disconnected from nature. And to me, what that means is being disconnected from yourself. And ultimately, I think we kind of look at nature as trees and the wildlife and all these things, but we don't instinctively or intuitively recognize ourselves at this moment in time as a part of nature. So when I say we're disconnected from nature, it's really rooted in being disconnected from ourselves. And so my mission and my goal is to remind people of themselves, of their own nature, and to reconnect with that nature, because I believe that that's where it starts. And if you have a relationship with yourself and you know who you are, I think that will naturally lead you to commune with the other parts of yourself that we call nature, which is like the wildlife and trees and stuff like that. But I think we have to recognize who we are first, and then that will take you on that trajectory.
I mean, we live such automated, mechanized lives, and so much of our lives are taken up with labor where we perform these machine-like repetitive tasks. People really forget that they are natural beings. They forget who they are. And I think every one of us can attest to that, that we get lost in this world because it's not intuitive. It wasn't really designed to meet our actual needs. It wasn't really designed for us as humans. I mean, it was designed for a system that actually goes against, the true values of nature.
I think that we obviously created this as humans. We created the system, but at first, I think that it was we were trying to escape a natural situation. We didn't like the fact that we didn't have abundance of food, or in the way that we do now. We didn't like that there was day-to-day things to be done to survive or to thrive in a given environment. So we wanted to kind of go around that natural order of things. That's why we domesticated food. That's why we, built civilizations that hoard all the resources. So all this has been kind of culminating, but in the process, like you said, we lost ourselves, and we lost that connection with ourselves, which we were not accounting for because we didn't have the wisdom like a lot of traditional people have, and they stick with, to not deviate from the natural order of things because there's consequences to that. So what we're seeing now is just the repercussions or consequences of that decision that we took to remove ourselves from the natural environment because we didn't want to accept or embrace that position that we were in.
So on your channel, I watched a really interesting video that was basically titled like, what is Indigenous, or what does it mean to be Indigenous? And I spent a lot of time in the climate movement and in activist circles. And I think it's almost a cliche at this point that Indigenous wisdom, Indigenous solutions are the most prime and direct solutions to the problems of climate change, the problems of industrialized society. So what does that actually mean? I mean, it's been repeated so much that I think a lot of people don't even really understand what it means to be Indigenous. What does that mean to you?
I have a meaning that I have for myself that I reflect on, and it might not be, what other people see it as, but to me, it's to have a relationship to a certain place. So we are all really indigenous to the earth, right? We all come from the earth. But the thing is that a lot of us have been born in situations that were insulated from the actual natural earth. So even though we're born on planet Earth, we're born into simulated environments that insulate us from having that relationship with a particular place. So you might be born in Los Angeles, you might be familiar with the streets, the restaurants, the businesses, but you're not familiar with what's under that, what was originally there, which is like the natural landscapes, the flora and the fauna of the place that we now call Los Angeles, right? So that's what Indigenous means to me, is to reclaim and have that relationship with a particular place. So, I encourage everybody to reach within themselves and reclaim that indigenous part of themselves, because at the end of the day, we're all human beings, and we have the capacity to relate to land, to relate to the earth in this way. So some people will say like, well, indigenous people are traditional people that are still living that life way. But my focus, because that's where I come from, is to remind those people that come from where I come from to awaken that within them. Because the people that are already doing it, they're already sustainable, right? They're already in the Amazon living in completely sustainable harmony. And my message isn't for them. They already know what I'm talking about. That's just their life. But for the people who come from where I come from and who feel that, like you're saying, that part that's missing, that's who my message is for, to win that indigenousness within them.
So Amanda and I are both from the South, and we have a really interesting relationship with like land in the South. I think people really prize like being rural and being, getting dirt on their knees and, going outside and going mudding and all that stuff. But it's a really kind of like parasitic relationship with nature. Amanda, can you kind of speak to that?
Oh, certainly. Well, as we all know in the South, the narrative is very much, what can we get out of something? Sure, we have this sweet Southern etiquette, but we very much just, and I say we because, again, yes, I'm from the South, but luckily I've learned better. But anyway, speaking overall, the narrative and the paradigm, the way of thinking in the South is very much just, what can we get out of the land? What can we get out of each other? It's very much an exploitative relationship that is had with nature. And it's ironic because, the South is known to be populated mostly by farmers and even plantations and just, hundreds of miles and acres of crops. Yet people still view themselves as completely separate from the land that they're tilling and cultivating, and the things that they're demanding from the land, they still see themselves separate from. And to me, that blows my mind. But when it comes to that narrative and the fact that people are so prone to see themselves as completely separate from the earth, when you say, I encourage people to look within and get back in touch with nature and so on and so forth, would you agree that the reason some people are hesitant is because they automatically assume that to be quote unquote in touch with nature is to be primitive, and it's like automatically people think they have to go backwards in order to have a strong relationship with nature?
I think people definitely do perceive things in that linear way where they believe that time as it progresses that we're progressing, right? So the higher the year count is, the more advanced we are. But I don't look at nature and the processes as linear. It's more of a cyclical, it's more of like you're either in balance with nature or you're not. Right now, we're not imbalance with nature, and it doesn't matter what technologies we create or how advanced we seem. If it's not sustainable, that's not the pattern that I want to give energy to, because a natural system is sustainable infinitely. And it goes through different cycles, sure, but I think when people think about getting back to nature, they don't realize that they're missing something very valuable. And it's easy to just say, well, that's just, we came from that. But they're not realizing that what they can get out of that relationship is so valuable because they've never had that relationship, and they don't see the benefits in it. They're just seeing how it could maybe be an inconvenience, or they're just focused on, like you said, like people look at it as an exploitative relationship. So they say, well, what can I get out of nature? They don't really know, because that's not the kind of thing that you can kind of quantify in that way, to where like, oh, I received X amount of fulfillment or X amount of oxygen and clean air. Like, it's just harder to quantify these things. Whereas, in the civilized world, we can give people money and they can kind of very clearly quantify and measure, certain levels of success in that world, but in the natural world, it's more something that you have to feel.
Well, quantifying things in that way, I mean, something especially as fundamental as oxygen and water. I mean, one of the most nightmarish things I've heard in my lifetime is people talking about how water is now a resource that's going to be traded on the market, and that there are going to be wars waged over water. And it's like, how could you put a price tag on something that comprises us, that's something that is life itself? And that's the the corrosion of this money mentality and of this infinitely reductive, quantified, separated worldview, where you don't see the value in completeness. You don't see the value and the wholeness in, being a part of something that is, this beautiful, cyclical, completely connected cycle of life. My greatest nightmare, one of my greatest nightmares, I do a lot of traveling. I've traveled all over the United States. I've traveled to Guatemala. I've traveled in Eastern Europe. I've traveled, and the greatest nightmare for me is to go someplace and to just see it become the exact same, identical, cubed off, infinitely reduced, compartmentalized suburb, where everything is the same. It's the same brands. It's the same cubes of McDonald's, Burger King, Chipotle, Target, all of these things. But it's like I've traveled 1,000 miles from where I grew up in the suburbs, and I think that, one of the most disconnected environments imaginable. And to travel 1,000 miles and to see, like, the suburbs of Los Angeles look exactly the same. It's like I haven't been anywhere. It's like there's no diversity at all. It's like the same thing. That's terrifying to me, to imagine a world that is completely reduced and replicated to be this. That's progress to people. And any sense of progress that is actually antithetical to human health and happiness and to, like, our spiritual well-being is not progress at all. So anybody who thinks that going back to nature is a regression, it's like anything that skips nature is a detour. We can't get home if we don't go through nature, which is ourself.
Right. You're always going to come back to the source. Like, you can try to elude it or run away from it, but at the end of the day, that's why there's so many conversations right now happening about climate change, about sustainability, because at the end of the day, if this earth is not healthy, if we can't perpetually, have this relationship of taking resources and putting it back into the earth, if it's not healthy, then everything else that we're doing does not exist. Like, civilization does not exist without nature. Nature is the original world where everything comes from. And the sooner we realize that and have a relationship with that, the more we can move in different ways. Have you seen my video about cancers, where I compare the earth to cancer? Because what you're talking about when you travel, you're talking about metastasis, when cancer cells spread from one part of the body to another part. So you're having that phenomenon where you're saying, oh, Los Angeles kind of being copied and pasted into another part of the earth. As metastasis, this idea, this mindset, this culture is spreading to other parts of the body, and it's just copying itself. And then we're taking resources from the healthy part of the body, which is like the parts that still have natural areas where we can use resources because everything else has kind of been taken up. They take the resources and they channel them. Instead of like giving it to the body, they channel it to the tumors, which is these cities that we erect, because that's where all the energy is going to feed this mindset, and it's just like a phenomenal thing to observe, because I've done that too. I've been through Costa Rica, Mexico, Belize, all these different countries, and I just see more of kind of where I came from, or at least a direction towards there, right? Like that's where they're trying to move towards. That's what they kind of idolize in a way, the culture of the U.S., because that's what's pushed, and that's kind of what they see and they glorify in a way, because that's what's on TV and that's what they want to allude to, And so it's like I see people from America going to these countries being like, man, y'all had to figure it out. We need to be more natural. And then the people from those countries are like, well, I'm trying to get to America so I can have all the stuff that you just left, And so it's just like, it's such an interesting thing for me to observe.
I traveled to Guatemala actually, for that same intention, because I wanted to see people living closer to our original configuration, our original nature. And I mean, it was an incredible journey. I mean, it was one of the most beautiful places I've ever been, and the people were so kind, and they were genuinely much closer to a sense of connectedness, to a sense of this very fundamental, just profoundly simple, like truth that everybody there just kind of had this realization that everybody looked each other in the eyes. They kind of realized like, okay, we're all here, whether we like each other or not. We are all kind of share this space, where in New York City, you're walking down the street, nobody looks anybody in the eye. It's like people are trained to disconnect themselves, to harden themselves off, to protect themselves from having to care about all these people, because that is our instinct, to care about the people around us. And it was that journey to Guatemala really changed me, And I was disgusted at the other white people that were there with me, at the tourists that were not there to learn, that were not there to connect with themselves, their true selves, and seeing the peoples of these places as teachers, as people who are closer, who are more advanced. They were just there to party and to take advantage of this beautiful country. And the people who live there couldn't even appreciate and use not use, but enjoy their own country. They had to serve these people, these ungrateful, just suckers, these leeches that were coming to their country. And one of the most depressing things I saw there was the health of the people there, that they were eating fast food, they were eating the fried chicken. And I got this interview. I was filming the whole thing. Someday I'll release it, I'm sure. But I was interviewing this guy. He worked with the local people there, and he was talking about basically teaching them how to reconnect with their own indigenous ways of growing food, because they've been disconnected. They've been forcibly cut off by this colonial apparatus, by this colonizer state that came to their country, enslaved them, took it over, literally killed their leaders and their attempts to organize and to come together, and just treats their entire country as a resource to exploit. They see, that's the Western attitude, that they see nature as an inventory for exploitation. And you said a really profound thing in one of your videos that was about how indigenous perspectives on nature, it's like you don't see it as resources, you see them as relations. Could you talk about that?
Yeah, I think that the relationship that we tend to have with things is like, because we do accumulate things and we tend to have this, well, let me take this back to my house, and it becomes like an object of things that we're collecting or that we see potential use in, but we don't necessarily revere the plant, the animal, the tree as its own entity, where a lot of traditional cultures, they saw these other organisms as their own people, like their own non-human persons. and they treated them as such. Like I know Native Americans, they referred to like the certain different plants as nations. Like, so if you saw like a tree, you might be like, oh, that's a sequoia nation, because you're recognizing it as a entity, because you see it throughout your environment and you know that they're a certain type of organism. It's not just it happenstance. Like, you can know what kind of food it produces, what are the cycles of it, and it's a functioning organism. So and then on top of that, you have a relationship because you come across it, and you might take something from it. You might take a fruit from it, or you might take the bark from it. And so this codependence starts to impact the way you perceive it. You know, like, we can just go to a grocery store right now and just get anything we want. We don't have to know where it grows, what are the seasons, what different stages does that plant exhibit. Like, most people probably don't know like what the full stages like of a lettuce plant are. Like, if you let it to go to flower and just fully develop, they don't know that. They only know lettuce in the form that is presented at a grocery store. So this disconnection from the process of life itself makes us relate to things differently, you know. And because we are going to the grocery store, it becomes a commodity. It becomes just another product. But say you were on the land and there was a certain plant that was growing, and it only came seasonally. You would know very intuitively, very intimately when that time was coming again. You will start to see the signs of it because you're connected to it as a food source. So you start to develop this relationship to where it's way deeper than just a product. It's way deeper than just a food. This is a being that I have a mutual relationship with, and that we affect, and it affects us, you know. And so I think that that's a whole different way of perceiving other organisms than most modern people.
So it's safe to say that the disconnection we have from nature, from the process of life, is exactly what's facilitating this death spiral that society is in, because we no longer witness these evolutions and these processes that begin as a seed and come full fruit, you know, that serve us and give us life. We don't see any of that. We just see things boxed up, brightly colored in plastic packages in the supermarket. And, you know, the saying goes, everything we do against nature, we do to ourselves. And so, again, separating ourselves from what is essentially a part of us, you know, the wilderness, animals, plant life, and what have you, is again something that it's just another mark. It's just another mark against ourselves. Like this separation. How do we bridge that gap? You know, that becomes a question: is how do we re-bridge the gap that we've created through industrializing society? Because I believe that's what it boils down to. You were mentioning a minute ago how people, you know, they tend to think, well, I'd rather just take this home and call it my own, and they view it as a resource instead of a relationship. That's because our society is premised on acquisition. Acquisition is essentially the art of possession, you know, so we have to have it, we have to own it and call it ours, instead of realizing that it is its own entity, and it is an organism just like we are, that really requires a certain level of, for lack of a better term, respect, regard, honor, input, care, cultivation, what have you. But again, we just thrive. Well, we don't thrive. We're surviving on this exploitative relationship that we've created since the industrial age, basically.
Yeah, and I think that we often overlook what that does to like the human spirit. That experience, you know, it's just, we just look at food as food. Like, oh, we'll just put food in your body when you're hungry, and that's it. But there's something much deeper than that happening when you do have that relationship that most modern people just simply aren't experiencing. And for me, my approach, like, I don't have like this thing where I'm like, oh, step one, step two. Like, my approach is just to change people's perspective, because I believe that if you can change the way they perceive themselves in the world, that every action that they take will be a derivative of that. So if I tell people, look, you are nature, you are a part of nature, this is what you are, like wake up and realize that, I believe that their actions will align with that. So they might go to the grocery store, and now they're looking at, well, what was somebody who's a part of the earth, what's the best decision I can make at the grocery store? what's the best decision I can make, you know, in my relationships to be a healthy person, to have a healthy community. What's the best decision I can make when it comes to choosing a career or offering my purpose, my service to the world. I think that's where I'm very general. Like, I'm not the person who's teaching permaculture and teaching, you know, regenerative agriculture. Even though I support those things, I'm more focused on the mind, of changing the perspective of people and getting them to even see life in a certain way, so that they do begin to explore all these different avenues through which we do reconnect.
So, considering your premise is largely based on that connection to nature, I do have a burning question for you. But as a striving vegan, I have often wondered, is there in fact a karma related repercussion in consuming the animal products, especially, and plants too, that are cultivated through this horrible, wasteful, inefficient system that just basically births animals to torture and slaughter and sell them? You know, obviously there is the actual material logistic side of it that deserves a whole other argument, like, you know, the inefficiencies and waste of globalization when it comes to food sources. But when it comes to the karmic, spiritual, and even physical repercussions, what would you say to that?
I believe that anything can be done in a harmonious way and a non-harmonious way. And obviously, the most sustainable people throughout time have eaten animal foods. They were just not doing it in the manner that it's done today. So we know that there is a way that animal foods can be procured which have a harmonious impact on the environment, on the ecology. In the same way, with plants, is the same thing. There's a harmonious and non-harmonious way that can be done. So I don't think it's about the kingdom of life that we're taking. It's about how we're taking it. So because we have the perspective and perception that we do, anything that we do is tainted because we're already starting from a disconnection from the natural world. So if we plant foods, we're just asking ourselves, well, how can we grow this the biggest? How can we make the most profit? And that's the bottom line, right? There's not much talk of like, well, what are the repercussions long term to the environment, to the soil, and to the health of the people consuming these foods? Those are like secondary and tertiary questions, if ever asked. So the same thing is done with animal foods. For me, it's not about the kingdom of life. It's about how we do anything. So, there's people who are doing, regenerative agriculture, who are putting, certain nutrients back in the soil using animal grazing and stuff like that. I think that that's all important. I think that this is it's a community of things coming together to create balance in an environment, and that's how it's supposed to be. And I was vegan for 5 years, so I really got to embrace and see that part of myself and embrace that part of myself. So I just shifted kind of my perspective on that, recently. But yeah, I think it really just comes down to how we do things. It's not about what we're doing; it's how we're doing it. Anything could be done right if we just have that starting point. Like if we just start from knowing and understanding that we're part of this natural cycle, we'll respect and honor things in a way that we wouldn't if we didn't know that or didn't remember.
I think it's interesting the perspective of thinking about every decision you make, filtering that through the perspective of the earth. I think that's personally one of the most profound shifts that I was able to come to. And I think I came to that through travel, through basically just dissolving myself into these enormous landscapes and really going from place to place to place and realizing like this earth is my home. This is the only true home that I'll ever have. I mean, people ask me where I'm from. A lot of people ask me where I live or where I want to settle down. I just can't really imagine settling down and picking one place because and I hope that this isn't you have to be vigilant when walking down this road to not walk the colonizers' walk and be like, oh, the whole earth belongs to me, because it's not a relationship of belonging and ownership, but it's like we belong to the earth everywhere, and this is our home. And to really have the earth in mind with every single thing that we do, starting small, at what we eat, what we consume, how we shop and things like that. I mean, I think those are ultimately kind of smaller. They're secondary to what is the belief system that we are living for. Are we living and supporting a system that is fostering the growth and the health of the earth, or are we supporting one that is destroying it? And it's like so many people put forth veganism as a solution to climate change. And I think it in many ways, I mean, we absolutely need to massively limit the amount of meat that is eaten, the way that it's fostered and grown and cultivated. It's horrible. Our food system is terrible. But I think a lot of people select that because it is a consumption choice, that they can change the way that they're spending money and tell themselves, I'm saving the world now. When in reality, it's the whole matrix of buying and selling and commodification and the whole monocropping system. It's the whole consumer cycle that is the problem. There is no ethical way to consume our way out of this crisis, because we will forever remain in this consumer model where we are devouring the earth. We're taking from it. We're not living for the earth. And to anyone listening, I really just encourage you to start asking that question, putting that filter before your actions and thoughts and behaviors. What am I living for truly? Because so many of us, we're living for capitalism. We're living for this system. We're living without even realizing it. We're supporting this system that is destroying life on earth, that is reducing every precious and sacred thing to something that is, a dollar sign. And, whether we are going about our lives, saying, okay, I'm trying to live mindfully, I'm trying to live whatever, I'm on a spiritual path, your adherence to this financial structure, this edifice, this deeper culture that is so unquestioned, goes so much deeper than that. And I think before any of us take that step to be like, oh, okay, I'm living for the earth, I'm on a spiritual path, we need to really question the systems that we are adhering to.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. So with the veganism, right? And this idea that because I put it this way, like you're basically just shopping from a different aisle in the grocery store. And I think that any solution that's a true solution is very hard, if not impossible, to commodify, like to turn into a commodity. And that's what's happening with veganism, right? Like now it's just these plant-based meat alternatives. And we just kind of see the whole system kind of capitalizing on this social movement. So it's just kind of becoming another tool for that same system, right? Like the thing that it was supposed to kind of change. And so it becomes like this like self-defeating thing where, because to me, anytime we outsource something, it just becomes challenging to track, right? So if somebody else is growing my food, I don't know how they're growing it. They might be telling me they're doing this or doing that. I'm just wary of things that can be easily commodified, because I think at the end of the day, the more responsibility we kind of reclaim, that's really the name of the game. Like if I can reclaim producing food, growing food, if I can reclaim my health, all these things just takes responsibility off of the system. That's the reason why we're in the situation we're in, because we have outsourced all of our responsibility to the system. So the system tells people how to be healthy. It took over people's health. It took over people's food. It took over people's education. We have to slowly start to reclaim those things. So we have to teach our children. We have to become educators. We have to grow or harvest food from the environment, build a relationship with that. We have to do all these things for ourselves. And the thing is that's work. That takes energy. That takes dedication. It takes discipline. So for people who are already in that system, it's like, well, I already have this system set here. I just want to operate within the bounds of it. So if you bring in like something like veganism, it becomes a pretty easy transition. I can just choose different foods now. So where if, like, say for instance, like you're trying to become a homesteader and you start in New York, that's going to change the whole trajectory of your life. Like you're probably going to have to relocate somewhere. You probably have to buy property. You're going to have to learn how to really grow food and produce food. Like it just becomes a whole different lifestyle that I think most people aren't really willing to take on. So it just kind of becomes like, well, what can I do from the most comfortable position? And so I question that a lot of times, and some of my content does get into that, and I get a lot of backlash because obviously people don't want to be told that what they thought was like the ultimate solution may not be the end all be all.
Well, of course, I have to speak up for myself and other vegans or striving vegans that see it a lot differently. I totally agree with you and Marlo. Gorgeous points that you all made so very articulately about the fact that veganism has become just another trend. It's just another commodification, another form of convenience because of, like you said, the freezer aisle, the veganism aisle, the whatever, the plant-based meats and stuff. You can still have the same food you essentially had before you made the switch because of innovations like the plant-based meats. And that's all fine and good. But myself personally, and a lot of others I'm sure would attest, have gotten into veganism to make that reconnection to nature. Like it started from an empathetic place, like, oh my gosh, I can't bear what's happening to these animals by the millions each year, not to mention what it's doing to my health and the health of the planet and the health of my community. So it started an empathetic place. And so like myself personally, the way I practice it is I try to stick to a whole plant-based diet. And I try to raise most of the food that I eat. And I try to propagate that mindset and that concept to my community, so that they're not just sucked right into the commodity vacuum. They're not just like, oh, okay, this will be easy. I'll just shop over here instead of over there. So I think that it is still possible to subscribe, if you will, to these different forms of nutrition and lifestyles without falling into, the commodity vacuum. You just, again, like you said, have to have the discipline and the mindset that's geared toward the greater good, not just your good and not just convenience.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, I think you're doing it right, Amanda. I mean, you're really putting a lot of effort and intention into, regaining that actual connection with nature. Like somebody going to the grocery store and buying a pack of Beyond burgers and throwing them in the microwave isn't connecting anybody with nature. And I think anybody who thinks that that's enough, it's just not. It's good. It's a good thing. I mean, honestly, I think a lot of those soy products are, grain fed. They're using monocrops. They're in their own way destructive on a probably comparable scale to, industrial farming, feedlot meat, which is terrible. I mean, it's a horrible thing. The way that animals are raised today is a sin that is unimaginable. It is terrible. The difference between a farmer on an organic farm raising cattle that are allowed to roam, that are able to nurture the soil, that are able to, live an actual life, where they're able to move in the natural way and be among their own kind and live in the sun. I think that's a completely different thing altogether. I think factory farming itself it's an extreme version of humanity's ability to totally just say, oh, these beings, they are lesser than us. They're not as important as we are. They're not as intelligent as we are, whatever. And they're totally justified in killing and eating them, and basically seeing them as their whole purpose is to be killed and eaten. Outside of any ecological context, outside of living a life, they're just raising them in a prison cell to eat, and that is completely wrong.
Right. And myself personally, I don't even have a problem with people eating meat. It's just the factory farming. And I think that the factory farming itself speaks volumes to how disconnected we are to the process of life. If nothing else does, I think that does. But we certainly don't want to have an entire episode based on veganism. So I'm happy to move on if you all are.
Quetzal, I wanted to talk to you on this show, or I wanted to talk to somebody about this for a while, is kind of indigenous perspectives on money. And on this show is called Moneyless Society. It's sort of premised on the shift away from the monetary system to a new way of organizing things. And that has been sort of a long held kind of intuitive assumption that, it's not even an assumption, it's a fact that the majority of human life, we didn't use money to organize ourselves. And I think getting back to nature is a more prime way of getting back home, getting back to our true self. I think moving beyond money as something unnecessary, as something that is like a vestigial organ or a tumor or something that is like this parasitic adaptation, is something that's totally necessary. So what is the indigenous perspective or just your perspective on the use of money?
This is kind of how people interpret this idea of no money. And I believe things should be free to access, but I think that there's always going to be an energetic exchange with anything, right? Like people like groceries, fruits, vegetables, there's a process to that. even if you are not growing it, even if you're getting it from the wild, there's a process to get there that is required from your body to look for the food, climb the tree if you need, whatever, to harvest it, process it, make it edible. It's all an energetic exchange. So I know people throw this word around a lot in the community. Calorically, an exchange happening for you to harvest and get food from the environment to consume that energy. And that's what the thing that people like to argue, like, well, there's not really no value and it's not really backed up by anything. Like, if we want to trade this, then we can do that. We need that money piece. And to me, it ultimately comes down again to how we do things. Capitalism can be done consciously. The way it's done today is a derivative of a disconnection from the earth. And we haven't even began to explore the possibilities of what a conscious capitalistic society implement. I'm not saying that that's what I'm pushing for, but I'm saying that's not something that most people think about. They just think, well, let's dismantle the whole system. So when we're talking about indigenous tribes, it's bigger than that. I think the reason people don't have an issue with money is because that they're not in their purpose. It doesn't matter if you're in a socialist, capitalist society, or if you're in the middle of the jungle, you're just not going to be fulfilled because you don't know why you're here or why you exist. But I think that money becomes a lot more relevant when people are out of their purpose. So let's look at money as an exchange system. I have services that I offer, but the core of why I act out into the world and offer the world doesn't come from trying to acquire more of that capital. It's not based in that. So that's how I look at it. Like the core of who I am is focused on that, although I do use that as a system. For me, it's like put me anywhere on earth under any system, and I'm going to do the best that I can, and I feel like I will thrive because I have a sense of who I am and what I'm here to do. And if I could hold that throughout any system, I think that I will experience a certain level of fulfillment and gratification. Money is just a tool. Like, it's just a system that we use. But obviously there's flaws within that on many levels, and we could talk about that as well.
I think we're both probably chomping at the bit to respond to that. I relish that perspective. My dad and I have this discussion a lot where he says, I believe, you can be conscious capitalist. And I just tell him, well, Dad, that's an oxymoron. I mean, it's a systemic contradiction. I don't know. It's kind of this question of like, if a spiritual awakening could occur on a mass level and people could genuinely be, grounded and can reconnected to that true self, that true nature, that true understanding and consciousness of the interrelations in their lives, that the system itself would all be obsolete. But I think the system as it exists today, it thrives on lack and scarcity and inequality and endless growth to the extent that it's always going to attempt to divide people, separate people, see resources as that inventory for exploitation, and it's always going to end up putting people into situations that further and further alienate them from the ground, from their interconnection with everyone around them.
Because essentially capitalism is a machine of convenience, as we know, and even if there were some way to consciously execute the mechanisms of capitalism, we're only going to further and further separate ourselves from nature, would be my understanding and my assumption, because as convenience through innovation continues to evolve, whether or not profit continues to be the main goal or not, we're just going to continue to further divide ourselves from nature. But what I like to boil it down to is two very simple, if this, then that type of thing. Like, can conscious capitalism fully absolve inequality versus how quickly would inequality cease to exist if we lived in a society, a systems design, which everyone had access to the same quantity and quality of everything? It's kind of hard to say that conscious capitalism or any form of monetary exchange could do better than a systems design that is completely open access.
Well, I think essentially what a resource-based economy is it's tethering value to the real resources of the earth. And I think that the money system as it exists today, and I'm doing a lot of research on this, I'm not the most articulate person to talk about this, but I was just reading last night, and it's like, it feels like a conspiracy. Every time I read about the actual functions of the monetary system, I'm like, is this real?
Right?
Is this a conspiracy?
This
sounds insane. This sounds like something that people in robes underneath like a crypt, like by candlelight with masks, are like creating. But it's basically that the whole money system functions on debt. It is literally based on nothing. It's based on debt. I'm not going to get too deep into the whole Federal Reserve and all of that, but basically, if debt was taken out of the economy altogether, if there was a debt jubilee and all debts were forgiven, there would be $0 circulating in the economy. So the whole economy functions, the deep functions of it, the driving force of it is that continued lack, of something that is created, and it creates the need, and then it profits off of that need endlessly. And it's a huge rabbit hole. It's one of the deepest rabbit holes you can go down. But I really, truly recommend everybody to ask those questions, to really question, how does our money system work? Because, we have this view, on the day-to-day basis of the way that we interact with each other and spend money. And I go to the corner store and I give, the person working at the register money and I get an apple or whatever. And that seems sort of normal. Or it's like, even say I'm the farmer, I grow the food, I sell the crops, and then I have money that gives me the resources to buy more tools and all those other things. That's what it would be like for us on our small level if we were not in this, massive, super stratified construct where people are juggling with billions and billions of dollars. And I think as we're sort of continually uncovering in this show that when systems like that are able to exist, they continually expand and increase the levels of inequality, because there's always a lack and there's always somebody who is gaining advantage over somebody else. So inequality is the natural byproduct of that system. And I think we could do this system more equitably. I know we could. It's so unethical. It's so unequal. It's so wrong in every way. Any improvement is something that I would really relish. And I think any improvement would naturally sort of tilt us toward getting back in touch with our true abundance, the true abundance of our actual capacities. But I don't believe that capitalism as it exists in any theoretical or practical form can exist without becoming that incredibly stratified, unequal, destructive beast that's devouring everything. That's really made us into commodities. That's made us into objects and beings that we put a price tag on. We put a value judgment on us as humans, instead of saying we are this earth, we are all our relations, we are everything in this world, and we are boundless in that way. And that's what it truly means to me to be free and to be human, to be the earth.
If you ask me about capitalism, I say conscious, because if I have to operate with the capitalism, I'm going to do it to the terms of who I am. You guys are operating under capitalism as well, right? Like your day-to-day life. I hear you, like you're for, a different system. I'm for changing myself and being more focused on that aspect. So when you ask me about capitalism, I ask myself, well, what's the best form that I can do that in? What's the best way existing under that system at this current moment? Not saying that that's something that I want to continue, but what can I control this moment? Well, it's the way I do business. So I'm going to do it in a way that's conscious, that's ethical, that's to the best of my ability under that system, right? So that's kind of how I look at everything. I always bring it back to myself, because I just think that sometimes I get a little overwhelmed by wanting change. And a lot of people, that stagnates them from their own self-development, because they're like, well, once we need to change the system, and they're not really truly doing work on a personal or internal level, because they think that that's going to come as a derivative of the system changing. But I look at it backwards. I think that if people change themselves, so if we have more people that do capitalism in a conscious way, that starts to shift the mindset of the collective consciousness to where we might make that system obsolete, or we might develop a different system, but we're not going to wait until that system shifts to start doing the best that we can. That's how I look at it. That's why I answered that question in that way.
I'm glad you chose to expound on that. Obviously, you exemplify how we do have a choice. We still have many limits, but we do have a choice. And not to put the burden of climate change and war and economic collapse and stuff on every individual, because that's the corporations' proxy, they shove all of that responsibility on us. But you're right, it does start on an individual level to a degree. And while conscious capitalism shouldn't be the end goal, it could be a step on the way to the new and better system that facilitates a happy and healthy environment for everyone. And that's where the resource-based economy comes in. And you were cutting out a minute ago, and I don't know if you ever said if you did or did not know about that term, but just in case you don't, and for the viewers who may still not know about it, it's basically a systems design in which everyone has access to the same quality and quantity of the products that they need to survive, and then some. And ironically, it is the most not only sustainability oriented, but the most nature oriented systems design, because resources such as food, water, shelter, and energy, natural energy, are responsibly managed. Obviously, those resources become relationships. They turn into that relationship like you were talking about earlier. We actually facilitate relationships with the resources that sustain us in a resource-based economy.
I think this is an interesting conversation. I kind of had this in the back of my mind. I felt like we might get to this territory, but it's this, for me, it's the question. It's like chicken and the egg thing. It's like, do we change the system that is, because we do all have this deep personal responsibility to take a direct accountability for our actions, for our consumer choices. Saying there's no ethical consumption under capitalism doesn't give you license to just go, consume horribly and eat McDonald's and all that stuff. You should try to be ethical and conscious, truly conscious of all of your behaviors and actions. And I think we do have a deep responsibility there. But I have this kind of, inner qualm or query of where that begins. Does it begin with a small, and I think I defer to Martin Luther King in one of my favorite quotes ever. He says, basically, change will come not from the majority. Change will come from a rebellious minority, basically. It's the change starts on the individual level, I think, in all of us deciding this system is not me. It does not represent me. It does not represent my values. So, I know a lot of people who would say, I'm an anarchist, I'm a communist, I'm a socialist, whatever, who are not taking personal responsibility for their actions and who are not moving ball forward on their own personal growth and development. And it's keeping that movement, all those movements, it's holding them back immensely because these people are still trapped in, the ecosystem and not working to reconnect with the ecosystem. And I think it's this balance between getting ourselves to the point where we are conscious, really conscious. And I think a lot of that, the preconditions of consciousness are meeting those most basic needs, that it's almost impossible to gain consciousness or to ascend consciously or whatever the terms people use are when you're hungry. Unless you're in the desert fasting and doing it intentionally, if you're living in an unintentional way, you're not in control of your own actions. You're ultimately subject to the scarcity that drives your existence and the competition and the struggle for survival. You're not going to ascend. So it's this balance between we need to work together collectively to make sure that our needs are met on a level that we can continue to go up that stair of personal development and personal growth. Because truly, if enough people do connect with that consciousness and understand that, yes, we can do better. Yes, everyone deserves the dignity of food, water, shelter. Yes, we need to validate our environment and we need to take care of it. Yes, we are connected on this level, not in just this broad woo-woo, oh, we're all one, but like actually we are all on this earth. It's a lot bigger and a lot smaller than all of us thinks it is. And we have to come together to change. We really I think there's a quote by Bell Hooks. She said, basically, change does not occur individually ever. It never does. I think anybody who has gone through a transformation, you didn't get there alone. There's these people that have these narratives that I pulled myself out of this, blah, blah, blah. But you had a community, you had support, that all of us, we need each other. And I think that reconnecting with that and seeding our personal development in interdependence, I think is really going to get us there. But I truly value your perspective. I really do. And I think so many people who do, align and spend a lot of time and energy on that collective shift alignment do need to look inward and do need to develop themselves personally. Totally. And I just think we all need to come together and learn and share. That's it. That's what it is. It's very simple.
Absolutely. And I think that everybody has their own purpose. Like when I speak and I represent my own perspective, that's just me. You know, that's just how my approach to life. Some people might resonate with it and others might not. But I think that everybody is playing the role that they're supposed to be playing. So, you know, for anybody listening, like, this is the role that I've chosen to embody in this lifetime. But I think that there's valuable roles that are different than mine, and that I'm not going to align with, but that others might gain value and fulfillment from. And like you're talking about, like speaking more to the collective and making that shift. Like, that's why I say a lot of times I'm not the one that's going to be pushing for legislation and doing things like that. That's just not my purpose, you know. But there is others whose purpose that is, who they do feel like a sense of fulfillment of drafting legislation and speaking to people who are in that realm as far as, you know, the legal aspect of it. I'm definitely more like of a self-development spiritual person who's kind of more focused on you know, harnessing the potential of the individual and letting that emanate into the collective. But I think equally too, like you said, there needs to be people who are speaking to the collective to make collective changes. They both feed one another, you know?
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I'm not the one that's going to be pushing for legislation either. I'm just totally past all faith in that system, that ecosystem. I thought of that term while I was cooking dinner, preparing for the show, that we live in an ecosystem and not an ecosystem. And politics right now is all about ego, and it's all about the expansion of the control and the stranglehold that they have on this system. I think, and this is kind of one of our central premises of this show, is that people forming their own functioning systems and moving away from the existing system, meeting their own needs. I mean, you know, performing mutual aid on our communities, helping our communities meet their most basic needs, because when we meet those needs, you know, we gain this incredible power of our true potential, that our true potential is so limited by this system that only sees us as, you know, a cucumber to rip out of the ground and chop up and put on its salad, if it's even that healthy. But we can transcend this. And I think us connecting with our true self, you know, the self in the individual, the personal, but also the self in the, like in the Hindu context, or in the context that Carl Jung talked about, where the self is collective consciousness. It's all life. It's the matrix of all existence, of everything living, everything on this earth, every person that has ever lived and ever will live, that is the self. That is self is consciousness. That's what we are here to realize, is consciousness, and not in this very, I don't know, that there's just so much, the New Age movement is so fraught with hypocrisy and egotism, that I know so many people that they claim to be in this conscious movement, but they're not even conscious of the ways that these systems, these economic systems, these self-seeking systems are just totally like a cancer occupying their development. And I think true connection to that self, to that nature within, like you're talking about, is an antidote to so much ideology, to so much of the trappings of these systems that we think of as normal. We think, oh, this is normal. This is who I am, but it's not.
I would want to challenge our listeners to heed everything that Marlo has said and add to that a little bit of action, a little bit of homework. Like, if you could just take 5 minutes a day, and through your daily activities, your routines, your usual errands and stops, choose one of them and ask yourself how much sense it makes. How rational is the process you're going through? What are the caveats involved? What are the inconveniences? How irrational is it really? You know, just kind of ask yourself those questions about just one thing that you do every day or a couple of times a week. And through that, perhaps a bit abstractly, but you will begin to understand and interreflect inherently, because you'll be like, well, this is what's inconvenient about what I'm doing, whatever that is. And this is why it's inconvenient to me. And then you start to realize all of the things around you that are incredibly irrational and ill-designed, and just how unsuitable the environment is that we live in now. And of course, you'll end up down the rabbit hole, but ideally, you'll begin to instead question yourself and doubt yourself. You'll start to build confidence in yourself and understand that you are not, You're not crazy for feeling these ways. You're not crazy for having these questions about your environment. You're not crazy for wanting to, spend more time in nature or wonder more about yourself. It's not a fanatical thing. It's not a, like Disneyland thing for you to want to sit and think about the stars or where you came from exactly, or what kind of tree that is in your yard. Like, people tend to just say, well, you're wasting your time, you're daydreaming, you're not being productive, when your mind trails off on things like that. But really, it's very important that we take a few minutes very often to just look around and say, why are things the way they are? Why am I having to stand in this line? Why am I having to drive 20 miles to this doctor's office or something like that? And just really contemplate the designs around you. And that will inherently lead you inward and give you some answers.
Just to think about every single object in your world as coming from the earth, and thinking about where it got there, and the human hands that shaped it, through totally exploitative practices, and the ways that it was ripped from the heart of your mother, from your mother's breast. It was ripped out and tortured into the shape that it is now, so that you can consume it thoughtlessly and throw it away. Quetzal, I think we are kind of running out of time here. I think this has been a really great episode, but I'd just like to ask you if you want to round us out here with any words of wisdom or advice or teaching for our listeners or for us, because I'm learning a lot. I love conversations like this, and I love the acceptance and the humble acceptance that we are all on our own place and our own path, and we have so much to learn from each other. We have nothing to gain by saying I know it all, and there's only one way that's correct.
Right. Yeah, no, I very much appreciate this conversation as well, and I'm glad that we can both recognize our purpose and as individuals, and realize that they both play a role within the collective, and that we're not all here for the same thing, but in a way we are, right? We're not doing the same exact thing, but we are ultimately all aligning ourselves with what I would call balance, which is what I teach, staying balanced, because that's what nature is. Nature is just perpetual balance. And yeah, I just wanted to, I know you gave some homework, but there's an app too. There's many apps, but you can get an app on your phone where it'll identify plants. So, if you want to go outside and take pictures of plants, it'll tell you what the plants are. The one I have is called Picture This, but I think that will be a helpful tool for people to just start exploring. It give you an excuse to start exploring, just to get to know the plants. But then further than that, you might learn about some of the uses, and once you start using it, that's when you develop a relationship with that plant, that organism. Just pick one. Pick one thing that you can start to develop a relationship with, because that's going to shift your perspective. And every time you go outside, now you're going to see that plant, and it's not just going to be a weed anymore. It's not just going to be this thing that you walk past. It's going to start to be a person-like organism that has its own characteristics, its own properties, and that exists out there in the world, and that you might have just been walking past this world, never acknowledging it. But I'm just, inviting people to start to acknowledge the natural world, the trees. It doesn't matter if you're in a city. That tree genetically is a derivative of nature, just like we all are. We are on the phylogenetic tree of life. We're literally all relatives. We're all related. We all come from the same A, C, T's, and G's that make up our DNA, the nucleotides. And so when we realize that, it's like we really are related. It's not like this spiritual. No, it's like a literal scientific fact that we are all related. And the more we realize and embrace that, that is going to make sure that we take care of ourselves and our relatives here on Earth.
I would recommend listeners to take your advice and start. I think a good suggestion would be to start with like the aloe vera plant. That's a really, really easy start for some people, because it's a succulent. It's really easy to care for. And I think it's a great way to start that reconnection, because it is a healing plant. So you get a sunburn, you get a bee sting, you get a mosquito bite or whatever, and you use that aloe vera plant to heal that spot, to soothe that spot, to treat the symptoms, to get myself familiarized with the plant kingdom and to make myself feel connected to it. I think that's a great one.
And the poison sting of our anxiety, the true balm to that is this realization that we are the earth, that this is all of us, that we are not confined to our body or our little room in our little house or our little job or our little commute. That's not what we are confined to. And this whole earth is and should be this marvelous, kingdom for us to explore, for us to connect with, for us to realize. Because when we travel through this earth, when we experience each other, when we see a new place and connect with a new plant, we are connecting with ourselves. We're connecting with what we're here on this earth, I believe, to learn, which is life.
Thanks for listening to another episode of the Moneyless Society podcast, and a special thanks to Wild Quetzal for this sacred conversation. A link to his YouTube can be found in the description box below. We so enjoy putting forth the effort to establish solid and sincere connections with our listeners. After all, our podcast is listener-supported, and we believe that such connections would be inherent in a system that values life and recognizes that the world around us is an extension of ourselves, that we are nature, and nature is us. We must build systems that not only foster that connection, but that don't exploit the world. Systems that utilize the world's resources instead, in a way that everyone is provided for. If you would like to support these systems being built, it starts with discussing them and bringing awareness to the systemic issues that prevent life on Earth from being a paradise. You can support our efforts by simply engaging with our posts on Moneyless Society Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, or by subbing to our Patreon at www.patreon.com/Moneyless Society. Even a $5 sub goes a long way. We also have a website at www.moneylesssociety.com where you can find resources to help you fulfill your highest goals. In solidarity, be well.